Atwick. Atwood. Let's try that again. That is not what I was trying to say. I'm having a lot of trouble talking today. This is going to be a pain in the butt to edit. Hey whoever's out there, I go by Grumblebug and I am currently reading The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Margaret. Let's recap. I read a lot of things in July. Yes, I am still talking about July. I'm new here. Give me a chance to catch up. I decided to break my wrap up into a few different parts. If you missed the first two videos, check out the cards up above or the links down below. Today I'm going to carry on with the traditional narrative style books that I read, by which I mean they aren't graphics based. And I've got a mixed bag. There's some literary fiction, some contemporary, some paranormal, a children's book. It's a little bit of everything. Check out the timestamps below if you want to skip around. Otherwise, let's do the thing. So the first book that I started in July was A Woman Is No Man by Etaf Rum. And here's the thing. I tried to sit down and give a nice, neat overview of all my thoughts on this book, but I couldn't do it. Not in a way that amounted to 3 minutes or less and would fit, I felt, appropriately in the context of a multi-book wrap-up. So I'm going to cheat a little bit. And I'm going to treat this like a teaser. Here are the broad strokes. This is a family saga following 3 generations of women within a Palestinian-American family. It's also a mystery and a coming-of-age story, and in some ways a character exploration story. And it deals with a lot of topics like culture and trauma and the ways in which patterns of behavior and expectations are passed down along family lines. I got a lot out of this book. I'm not going to say I enjoyed it, because to me it's not really that type of story, but it made me think. It made me evaluate some of my latent assumptions that I didn't realize were there. It made me feel all kinds of things, including ambivalence, because this book does a lot of really important things, I think, but I also think there's potential for it to do a decent amount of harm to the population it depicts, which is Arab American immigrants, especially when you consider things like confirmation bias, where people look to find evidence that supports the preconceived ideas they already believe in. To clarify, that's not necessarily a fault of the book or the author, it's the hazard of taking a piece of art and putting out into the world for other people to interpret. And that's a concern, by the way, that has been reflected in the opinions of some of the Own Voices reviewers whose thoughts I've been reading and listening to while thinking on this book. While others naturally disagree. They think that this book gives insight and voice to an experience that many women live but never have the opportunity to openly talk about. So understandably, people are divided, both those to whom this culture is not something they personally identify with, but also those to whom feel that this book represents or misrepresents an element of their own lived experience. So I realized that it's my channel and I can do what I want, so this book is going to get its own video. I want to do a standalone review of this book in which I can really hash out all of my mixed feelings, because there are many. And I also want to be sure to list out the extensive list of trigger warnings, because it's a pretty significant list. So if you want to see that review, make sure that you're subscribed. And in the meantime, you can check out the gist of my thoughts on this in my mid-year freakout tag video, in which I dubbed this one of the best books that I've read so far in 2020. Moving on. The next book I'm sure will sound familiar, and that is The Sun Is Also a Star by Nicola Yoon. I read this for the first time in 2020, and it wasn't my favorite. I enjoyed it, but it didn't wow me, and I didn't think too much about it after finishing. But I was reminded of it this year, and I stopped, and I really questioned myself, because after having read it once, I recognized that I really should have liked this more than I remember enjoying it. And I don't mean that theoretically I should have liked it, like I should have theoretically liked The Night Circus more. Looking back, the ways in which Yoon tells this story are right up my alley, and they're very effectively executed. So I read it again, and I'm really glad that I did. The Sun Is Also a Star is a contemporary young adult novel that tackles immigration through a handful of different lenses and situations. First, we have Natasha, who is an undocumented immigrant who was brought to the United States from Jamaica by her parents when she was a small child. She's a senior in high school, has spent nearly all of her life in New York, and like other high school seniors, she's in the process of planning for a really all-American future that she's worked very hard for. Prom, college, keeping in touch with her best friend, becoming a data scientist, because that's her dream career. Did I mention that she's a skeptic who doesn't believe in fate? and prides herself on making decisions using purely logic and not letting emotions get involved, because that's relevant. The thing is, this future that she has so carefully planned and worked for is crumbling away before her eyes, because tonight, Natasha's family is being deported. Daniel, meanwhile, is the son of Korean immigrants. They have given everything in pursuit of the American dream and ensuring that Daniel and his older brother, who's kind of an ass, by the way, just a heads up, make all the right moves to achieve a good, secure, and respectable American life. Daniel, however, isn't all that concerned with security or traditional ideas of what is respectable. He believes in love and passion and following your dreams, and he'd much rather just commit himself to a life of writing poetry and taking odd-end jobs to support himself, especially if it means that he gets to write off the interview that he has this afternoon for admission to Yale. But, you know, he kind of can't do that. This book tells the story of the day that these two teenagers spend together in New York City. They meet by chance, and they're both on a mission. Natasha needs to find a way to stave off her family's deportation. And Daniel, as soon as he meets Natasha, is determined to make her fall in love with him. We alternate between the two characters' perspectives, with a third omniscient narrator popping in to give us details on the lives of passing background characters, the various coincidences that our protagonists encounter but never know about, and the ways in which all these seemingly unconnected elements actually weave together and shape Natasha and Daniel's story. This book explores dreams and forgiveness, and this enigmatic place where science and fate may or may not, depending on if you ask Natasha or Daniel, intersect. After a second listen through, because I did listen to the audiobook, which is exceptionally well done, it's an ensemble cast, which I always appreciate, I really enjoyed this. I think Yoon is very skilled in how she tells this story, and also the ways in which she helps us to feel empathy for every single character and the specifics of their situation. My hang-up, I realized, was the insta-love. That is here. Though again, Yoon does handle it in a pretty nuanced way, looking back at it, but if insta-love is a deal breaker for you, then be prepared. You might struggle with this like I did. I will say that I am more okay with that element now, in large part because there's an epilogue that I choose to put a lot of emphasis on, and that helps my perception of how the love, insta-love thing went down. Just to clarify, Daniel is second-generation Korean American. Natasha is a first-generation Jamaican American. There are discussions throughout the story about race, culture, and their related experiences, like when Natasha and Daniel are walking down a neighborhood street together and are perceived to be an interracial couple. Yoon herself is Jamaican American and grew up in Brooklyn, where a lot of the story happens, so she's bringing her own first-hand knowledge and perception to this narrative. Next up, we'll talk about The Penelopeiad by Margaret Atwood. I had never heard of this before. It doesn't seem to me that it gets as much airtime as many other pieces of Atwood's work, which, I mean, it's got some steep competition, but this is an exploration of Odysseus' homecoming and the Greek epic, the Odyssey. The difference, though, is that this tells the story from the perspective of Penelope, Odysseus' wife, who was generally upheld as the definitive example of a loyal, honorable Greek woman in the classic mythos. If you're not familiar with the mythology, Odysseus was off fighting in the Trojan War, and on his way home, he does something dumb, and he angers the god Poseidon, who basically sends him and his crew to wander around the ocean, lost for 20 years before they ever make it home. Meanwhile, Penelope and her household, including her son with Odysseus, are besieged by suitors from local families who all assume that Odysseus is dead because he's been gone for 20 years. And they want to cash in by marrying his widow and inheriting his title and estate. Because, by the way, Odysseus was a king. There were a lot of those in ancient Greek city-states. Like, every city-state had their own king, so this was a thing. When he does make it home, Odysseus tricks his way into the house, gets in among the suitors, and basically slaughters everyone, including a dozen or so household maids, who Odysseus executes pretty brutally as punishment for sleeping with the suitors while he was gone. And in his mind, this was a betrayal of their loyalty to him. This, by the way, is all in the classic myth of the Odyssey. This is just background story. The difference is that this book approaches the story from Penelope's perspective. This was interesting for a lot of reasons. I'm not personally very familiar with Atwood's writing style in general. I haven't actually read any of her novels. I'm working on it. But in this work, she did a great job of keeping this story true to the tone of classic Greek epics. And I mean that both in terms of the narrative voice and tone, as well as in the structure of how the story is organized. She sets things up so that Penelope, our narrator, is now in modern day Hades, the afterlife. She's been there for centuries. Millennia? It would be millennia. She's been there for millennia, and she's telling her life and this story from her own perspective, which is not something that we ever really get from Greco-Roman literature. I can't think off the top of my head of any major instances where a woman is telling her own story. That's very much not how the oral tradition worked. The story itself is written as a novella. It's pretty short, but it's broken into chapters that very much echo the way that Homer structured his epics, like the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the chapters are also interspersed with bits that are meant to be performed, theoretically, by a chorus of the murdered maids. This was a very typical dramatic device used in ancient Greek theater, where plays generally featured a chorus of actors on stage, which often represented some homogenous group from the story, like the villagers, or the animals, or you get the idea. In this case, it's the maids. And this group narrates and comments on the drama that is unfolding on stage as we go. So we have this background in which Atwood maintains this very traditional classical tone, but she still gives a very modern commentary that somehow fits in the way that she narrates with Penelope's voice. But it's also incredibly relevant in modern times at the same time. In giving Penelope a voice, Atwood sidelines the generally accepted story from the hero Odysseus' perspective, and instead she gives a voice to the maids, these women who were unilaterally slaughtered by their master for things they supposedly did while he was presumed dead for 20 years. We move beyond this sanitized simplification of Penelope as a character, where she's just held up as this paragon of womanhood who never actually gets to speak for herself. And we get to consider her perspective as a woman who is simultaneously grasping at hope, at holding on to her home and her household, and that her husband is still alive, while also watching her home be besieged by men who all want to take ownership of her and the accompanying status that she carries with her, because that is her value in this society. More importantly, we learn a little bit more about, not a little bit, a lot of it. We learn a lot about the maids and a different interpretation to the story that gives us more insight into another explanation for their experience while their home, because they also live there, was under siege. The lengths that they, the maids, went to support their mistress and uphold their Lord Odysseus' legacy. Penelope talks in this about the overwhelming privilege given to men and their social and political interests within Greek culture, and the ways in which women suffered constantly in deference to those interests. She's talking about in ancient times, but it's relevant. There's also some super relevant discussion of rape culture and victim blaming, and the sovereign power that society, both then and now, generally gives to the male ego. I probably should have mentioned up front that I am a classics geek. I studied this stuff in college, so I really appreciate all that Margaret Atwood has pulled off here. But if you are also interested in Greco-Roman myth, or in mythology retellings, or in feminism and gender politics, and a narrative that looks at those topics in a historical context, but still with a very modern relevance, check this out. Also, if you enjoyed Circe by Madeline Miller, hands down, pick this up. There's some very similar concepts, and I think the writing style is fairly similar as well, while maybe being a bit less ornate than Miller was in Circe. Alright, we're working our way down in age of target audience and demographic. On my summertime middle grade binge, I picked up Archimancy, Book 1, Shadow School by J.A. White. This is a contemporary paranormal, and it's a nice blend of eventually wholesome takeaways, but with a respectable dose of low-grade creepiness. Keep in mind that I'm a wuss. It doesn't take much creep factor for my imagination to go wild, but it's kind of a darker tone and atmosphere, while still, very much being middle grade appropriate. Cordelia is our protagonist, and she has just moved across the country with her parents, and she's starting a new school year at Shadow School. Yes, that is really its name. I promise I don't know that it gets less hokey, but it works. This is a public intermediate ish school. I think it serves grades 5 through like 7, 8 maybe, and Cordelia's in grade 6 or 7. I don't remember off the top of my head. But this school is housed in a historic, more or less preserved mansion that was gifted to the school district decades ago by the family's estate. So, just to make sure we're on the same page, she's going to school in a big, historical, maybe Victorian, but like it's creepy mansion with like portraits all over and like original antique furniture, like the whole shebang. As she's just getting her bearings, Cordelia is shocked to realize that there are ghosts at Shadow School. All over it. Just hanging out and doing normal people things like reading a newspaper or checking themselves out in a bathroom mirror. She learns a couple other things in quick succession. First, most people can't actually see these ghosts. For some reason, she can. Second, Benji, one of her classmates, can also see the ghosts. He is just doing his best to pretend that he doesn't see anything out of the ordinary, keep his head down, and move on with his life. Cordelia isn't really content with that. Interestingly, these ghosts are doing the same things, like actions, over and over. It's like they're stuck repeating a pattern of basic, really mundane behaviors. But sometimes, after the school closes after dark, it appears that something comes along and takes the ghosts away one by one. Cordelia, Benji, and their friend Agnes, who can't see ghosts, but she's really great at research and she's invested in this project, they set out to figure out what's keeping the ghosts trapped at Shadow School, what is preying on them after dark, and if there's any way that they can help to set these souls free. This is fun. It's a spooky atmosphere, especially if you're into the old haunted mansion vibe. Our main cast has some diversity. Cordelia is biracial and Chinese American, while Benji is Latinx, specifically Peruvian. Those aren't prominent elements of the story, they're just discussed briefly here and there. But I think it's worth mentioning. That's my AC. Personally, I really liked the portrayal of friendship in this book. Our main trio balances each other out really well in terms of their personalities and how they tackle problems. More importantly, though, Cordelia herself is not always the best of friends. She becomes so fixated on solving this mystery that she becomes bullheaded and closed-minded and doesn't always treat people the way that they should. Benji, in particular, calls her out on this and really pushes her to be better, which is something that I don't feel like is always portrayed a lot in books, and I really liked seeing that. There's also this subplot of Cordelia trying to find the story behind a particular ghost. I won't mention the specifics, but you'll figure it out pretty quickly, and it's really endearing and emotionally poignant, and the way that it wrapped up had me teary-eyed. It was very bittersweet. Bonus! I found out the sequel just came out like 3 days ago, so there are now 2 books in the series that you can dive into if you're interested. I really hope my library gets the sequel. This last one will be brief. It is I Am Perfectly Designed by Karamo Brown and his son, Jason Rachel Brown. This is a simple children's book in which a child marvels at the world around him, and his father validates with each new discovery that the world is beautiful, and that the boy, as well as all of the individual people around him, each fit perfectly within that world, no matter where their explorations take them, no matter who they are, or what they look like, or where they come from, or what they do and don't like, they are all perfectly designed. The father and son each narrate parts of the book, going back and forth in a sort of dialogue, which I don't personally know anything about children's reading levels, admittedly, but practically speaking, I could see it working really well with a pair of people reading, either 2 parents or a parent and a child who's learning how to read, with each person reading one of the characters' lines. It lends itself pretty well to that. This book is super inclusive, with all different types of families and individuals shown throughout the illustrations. We see same-sex parent families, we see single-parent families, we see individuals with all different kinds of style and representation, like there's a punk rock dad at some point that was really cool to see. We also see different races and ethnicities and combinations thereof within family units. So there's a lot of room for kids and their parents to see themselves while reading this, which is super important. It was sweet, and it took me all of 5 minutes to read, but it's a book, so I'm counting it and I liked it, so there you go. That does it for the books and novellas that I read in July. All that leaves is part 4 of this wrap-up, which will cover the remainder of the comics that I read, as well as the gateway titles, basically, in my personal experience with manga. If you want to catch those, make sure that you subscribe to this channel, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up for me. And once again, I will leave you with a question. How do you feel about star ratings? Are they helpful to you when watching another person's reviews? Why or why not? Let me know what you think down in the comments. Thanks so much for hanging out. I hope you read something for